Have you ever looked at what's happening in the world and just felt like the conflicts we're seeing go way deeper than just politics? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down a really provocative argument from a recent broadcast. The idea that what America's really engaged in is a spiritual war.
And this quote right here, this is the entire premise. It's a huge shift in thinking. It reframes all the political disagreements not as simple mistakes in policy, but as a head-on confrontation with a force that genuinely believes its own destructive actions are, well, righteous. This is the exact lens we're going to be using for this whole analysis.
But what does that actually mean to confront evil instead of just bad policy? That leads us to the big question here. The source material argues that if you start to look at events through spiritual eyes, the entire game changes. So let's dive in and see what that perspective is all about.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to understand the battlefield itself. According to this viewpoint, this war isn't being fought with your typical weapons, battleships and tanks. Nope, it's happening in the world of ideas and ideologies. It's a completely different kind of fight. The source draws a really sharp line in the sand here. On one side, a political battle. That's about fixing bad policy, right? But a spiritual war, that's about facing an entity that has totally convinced itself that its harmful actions are actually good. So the real conflict, then, isn't about left versus right. It's about deception versus truth. So to make this idea of a spiritual war feel a little less abstract and more concrete, the source points to a very specific real-world example: the ideological regime in Iran. The argument goes like this. The Iranian regime isn't just your standard geopolitical player. It's presented as a theological revolution. Think about that. A system built not just to govern its own people, but to export its ideology all over the world. This means their motives aren't just about land or money. It's about spreading a very particular vision of faith. And to back this claim up, the speaker points directly to the regime's public record. These actions aren't framed as political moves. They're presented as the direct, violent results of that theological ideology. And, according to the source, it's all done in the name of God. And here's the kicker. According to the source, this isn't some hidden agenda they're trying to keep under wraps. The regime openly talks about its actions as being part of a final battle, an apocalyptic showdown meant to speed up the arrival of a messianic figure they call the 12th Imam. They believe this will kick off a global, violent transformation.
Okay, so after laying out this model of an ideologically driven force, the speaker pivots. And this is where it gets really interesting. They shift from an external threat to a historical warning, drawing a direct and pretty unsettling parallel between what happened in the Weimar Republic back in the 1920s and trends they see in the West right now. The source points to the Weimar Republic, highlighting the collapse of its moral compass, the rise of radical gender theory, and how euthanasia was being framed as compassion. The argument is that we are seeing echoes or rhymes of these exact same patterns playing out today. And to make this historical echo feel real and present, the source drops this pretty shocking statistic. It claims that Canada's assisted suicide program is on a path to surpass 100,000 deaths. To put that in perspective, that's more than the nation's military losses in all of World War II.
So we have this model of ideological warfare, and we have these echoes of historical collapse. The analysis now takes that same lens and applies it to what's going on in the United States, arguing that there's a kind of spiritual blindness happening right here at home.
The source lays out this dangerous three-stage formula. It argues that terrible things don't just start with violence. No, they begin with deception, redefining something cruel as compassion. Once that deception gets normalized and people start accepting it, the final step, actual physical violence, is presented as the inevitable result. And what's interesting is that this critique isn't just for one side of the political aisle. The source argues that both the left and the right are spiritually blind. The left gets accused of warning about fascism while at the same time embracing ideologies that have historically led to similar outcomes. The right gets accused of just ignoring the warnings altogether because they're focused on the wrong enemy. The bottom line? Both, it argues, are looking in the wrong direction.
All right, so if the problem is a spiritual blindness that cuts across the entire political spectrum, what in the world is the solution? Well, the broadcast ends by offering one that is, maybe unsurprisingly, not political at all.
This quote is really the first step in the proposed solution: recognition.
The whole argument is that you can't fight a spiritual war with political tools. The very first thing you have to do is just see the battle for what it is and to correctly identify the enemy.
So if the weapons aren't political, what are they? The source turns to the biblical idea of the full armor of God. The defense against deception is truth. The shield you use is faith. Your sword is discernment. These aren't just, nice ideas. They're presented as the active weapons you need for this spiritual war.
And this really brings us to the ultimate takeaway. The entire argument just boils down to this one single idea, that the real strength of a nation isn't in its economy or its military. It's in its moral foundation, its soul. And if that's lost, nothing else can save it.
So we end right where the broadcast ends, with a direct challenge. It isn't about who you should vote for, it's about personal awareness. The source leaves its audience with one final question, pushing them to look past the politics and just ask themselves, are they awake to this spiritual battle it claims is happening all around us?